We are here today to talk about the very important role that culture plays when it comes to community health. We know that we're not just brainiacs or analyzers and thinkers. We are whole people, and culture is a part of who we are. And culture is actually, in many ways, some have described a double-edged sword because it's both very critical for human development and progress, and quite frankly, it can also culture preserve oppressive power structures, right? Because not all culture is healthy. Not all culture is inclusive. Power structures like systemic racism, for example. And for our purposes today, we're going to be focusing on the impact that these roles have on the health and well-being of communities of color. And so, Gail, I want to first start with you with two questions, essentially. Number one, what is cultural intelligence? And number two, I'd like for you to help us level set on what we mean by use of the word culture and how we should be framing it in this context. So maybe we should actually take those questions in reverse. Let's start with culture as defined, and then what do you mean by cultural intelligence?
Sure. So, Lurie, I'm glad that you asked that first question in terms of what is culture, because we make a lot of assumptions when in actuality it's still a highly contested topic. In this instance, or in the instance of community health, we like to really think about culture in three ways. There's culture as ideology. So we refer to that commonly as cultural norms, right? It's information, it's ideas, it's belief systems that are transferred from one person to another, or one generation to the next, right? Yeah. Then we think about culture as a mediator, right? Of information and ideas, those specific information and ideas. And this we like to call the cultural frame, right? How things are perceived, so to speak. Some might call it the gaze in the humanities, the circles of humanities and writing, but it's a lens, right? It's the way that we view the world, how we interpret and communicate ideas and beliefs. And then finally, there's culture as influencer, and that's probably where we are concerned the most as it relates to community health. Because we are in fact trying to change things, right? So we have to change attitudes and behaviors, and culture is a tool used often by both positive and destructive forces to do that very thing.
So it feels to me like we're saying culture is an intergenerational, right, way of understanding and interacting with the world. I've heard some say that culture is how we determine collectively what we think is right and wrong. And it's a way of being, a way of knowing, a way of interpreting the world around us. So thank you for that. And it's important for us to have that understanding, because we need to be clear that multiple cultures can exist in one space in opposition to each other, right? Yeah. And so I think the audience needs to be very clear about that. There's not just one culture, y'all. Even within the Black community, we don't just have one Black culture. There are varieties of ways that culture can show up and actually does. Dr. Shepherd, this concept of cultural influence that Gail just shared with us, can you talk with us about the ways that culture can impact our health and how it influences our health at the individual level?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question. So there's a couple of ways that can be perceived. So we can think about cultural impact in terms of how we understand normal and abnormal, right? What does the normal body look like? What is the healthy, beautiful, able-bodied person? All of these things, all of these adjectives that we have relative to our, subjective perspectival understanding of health. And we can look at it in terms of, say the perpetuation of things like anorexia, right? I need to be a certain body size. I need to be a certain body weight. My body needs to be shapely in a particular way. So even though I could die from getting a Brazilian butt lift, my butt will look great, right? And so we have those kinds of things that push us into perceiving ourselves, and the people around us within a framework of health and beauty and normal and abnormal, right? The other thing that is becoming increasingly, I would say, more prevalent is self-surveillance. If you think of the impact of technological, advances, everybody who has on these little Fitbits, and you have all of your Apple gear that tells you, good morning, you didn't sleep well, or your heart rate is so and so and so and so, right? And so now you want these things not only because they're part of the trend, but you're also participating in sort of a collective evaluation of the self, right? And that tells you and is always monitoring you, and you're always monitoring yourself. And that also becomes a part of the sort of cultural collective consciousness. How am I supposed to behave? How many steps am I supposed to have today, right? So are you just walking in a circle because you want to make sure that you have the 10,000 steps because your office co-workers are doing a thing that you want to win? Or are you actually participating in active engagement because you want to be better, because you want to have a degree of wellness? Right? And so there's all of these little influences relative to, again, how we understand ourselves, how those selves are situated in society, and how they shape the way that we perceive our own bodies, not just relative to, are you sick or well? Are you beautiful, not beautiful? Are you abnormal? Are you normal? Right? And all of those things directly impact our understanding of our physical, physiological, and cognitive health.
So even as much as, I know our audience is diverse, but this is a Black show. So we think about the way that we come to value the aesthetic, like the Black aesthetic, the idea that I have lips are for, protecting my mouth or whatever physiological function they have. But whether or not I think my lips are beautiful is a form of culture. Like I have, these body parts and these body sizes and these body shapes and this skin complexion that serves a physical function, but how I feel about them, whether I have positive feelings towards them or negative feelings towards them, is also a function of culture. And as I'm thinking about the young folks who are coming up, as they, I'm a Gen Xer, so I remember what life was like before texting, and I miss those days because I'm a terrible texter. I'm terrible at maintaining technology. But my children, I'm noticing, have their native users. This is they speak this language, texting almost better than they speak English. And culturally, I'm seeing how these devices, in a non-medical sense, are really allowing them to sort of, I don't want to call it a hive mind, but all of the people in their space seem to have this same understanding. And so again, y'all, culture isn't just about wearing kente cloth and practicing Kwanzaa. We have like youth culture. We have the tech divide cultures. All of these things can help to impact who we are as a people and how we feel about ourselves and how we interact with our own bodies. But there's also a spiritual component to this, isn't there, as well, when it comes to our agency and our health? What would you say to the impact of culture spiritually when it comes to a sense of physical and I don't want to call it mental health, but physical and health of our interior and emotional environment?
And that one's me. I just want to.
Yes.
Okay. Well, a couple of things that you touched on, and hopefully I'll circle back to the overarching aspect of your question. But we also have to keep in mind that culture is fluid over time and space, right? And so if we, even in the way that we think of ourselves, I tell my students all the time, like, I was born Black and now I'm African American. And some people, what I'm saying? Some folks was Negro, and we also POV, and we BIPOC. And in about 10 years, we'll probably be something else. And that will shape our understanding of the self, right? If we want to, say, map that onto the way that we perceive our own bodies, I mean, we can look at, and I know everybody talks about Lil' Kim, but there's also like the Sammy Sosas that are out there as well, right?
That's right.
And having this sense of what does the healthy body look like, and being taught that the standard normative body is that of the white body. And so if I want to have a sense of beauty and health and normalcy, then people are pushing towards that, even though everybody else in the world, and I'm gonna just throw this out there, are trying to have, the full lips, are trying to have the full hair, are trying to have, I mean, get the Brazilian butt lifts for a reason. Who has those naturally? Just something to think about, right? And so the way that we understand ourselves, we have to situate that within the framework of mental health, right? And remembering who we are. And I think that a part of that as a community has always been situated within our spirituality and our religious beliefs, right? Even if we think of our revolutionary movements, right? Black power movements, et cetera, have always been sort of tethered to, our religious organizations. Even if you think of like the work of Malcolm X, right? Being tied to the mosque, right? And so there is an inherent relationship between the way that we understand ourselves, the way we understand our health, and the sort of metaphysical aspects of our health. And even if you look at, the way back histories, right, your 1500s and 1300s and all of these things, we tended to lean into our understanding of our metaphysical health, our spiritual health, our spiritual well-being, that allowed us to be able to get through so many varying levels of oppression. And I think that we continue to do that. And that's why when you have, these, I always call it the attempts at genocide of Black men is what we are experiencing, right? We are actively being hunted, right? And we lean on the church to help us make sense of what we are experiencing culturally. We lean on each other. That is who we are as a people. And that provides us with a sense of solace that allows our mental health to have some kind of foundation. So I don't think that those things have necessarily been mutually exclusive in the Black community, because that's been the sustainable thread for us, that kind of spiritual, metaphysical health that allows us to get through the everyday aspects of our oppression, that, just as an aside, has also consistently dampened our immune systems, right? Racism in and of itself is the, global pandemic that we have been fighting for hundreds of years. And so when COVID comes, this is a second pandemic for us.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So our immune systems have already been dampened. It's called cross-sensitization, actually. We cycle through the general adaptation syndrome because we're always in fight or flight. If you're being pulled over, what happens, right? Your nerves get bad, your heart starts beating fast, your cortisol level increases.
Even if you're driving by somebody else who's been pulled over, your nerves get, secondary
into
trauma.
The spiritual aspects, what do you say? You're like, please let them be okay, Lord, be with them, right? You might have a whole prayer.
Yes.
Because the reality is that could be the last time that they do anything, right? And so our immune systems are always cycling through the general adaptation syndrome because of our first pandemic. So when the second pandemic hits, our immune system now has to sort of disaggregate and fight yet another thing. And then we wonder why we have so many people in the African-American community who were hit by COVID worse than anybody else. And it really is because our immune systems were already at work. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that we don't spend enough time talking about the intergenerational, the epigenomic, the impacts of race and racism on our bodies and on on our health as a whole. And we need to do that if we want to be able to make long-term change. Otherwise, everything else that we do will be anecdotal. We'll just be putting band-aids on things and not really looking at what the meat of it is. And the meat of it is, we're always already fighting. So when
you're making me convinced. You're convincing me that, again, my original theory, which is that we have to leave and find someplace else to go, because if oppression is dampening our immune system, and not that was at all your point, but see where my mind goes, we got to go. I'm in flight mode. I'm like, we got to get out. The movie mattered. I'm in flight mode.
Like Marcus Garvey was on something. He was on
flight and freeze.
He wasn't wrong. Gail, I want to come to you in light of that. I'm stuck on oppression dampens our immune system, because to me that means we all have pre-existing conditions. Like we tried to say it was just people who were Black and overweight, Black with diabetes. Nah, if you Black, you have a pre-existing condition because our immune system have been weathered. Gail, I want to come to you. Can you talk with us a bit about the way that culture, some of the ways that culture as an ideology can influence community health? Because as we're talking about this, in my mind, when I was approaching the conversation, I was thinking about Black culture, but now I'm thinking more, just as a result of this conversation, about the fact that we are a culture trying to survive another culture. And that to me just elevates the level of concern even more than it already was. Lord bless my heart pressure. What are some of the ways that culture as an ideology can also influence our community health?
Well, I think Imani did a really good job of giving us examples in contemporary culture, society, where we are impacted by just visual imagery that we see on a daily basis in terms of what we should do to our bodies, what it should look like, what we believe is attractive, right? So it also determines kind of what we hold dear, right? And what is acceptable versus what is frowned upon. So in this instance, I think it requires us to think about culture as ideology, but also culture as a mediator, right, of power and authority, right? So culture actually determines how resources are allocated. It is put in place to maintain structure and order in a particular group or society, right? So I'll give you an example. Culture mediates, the media itself is an example of culture mediating, right? How we process information, actually what information we get to begin with, right? And so if we don't know that our polling places have been closed, we talked about this in an earlier episode, Ms. Lurie. If we don't know that our polling places have been closed, we can't vote. If we can't vote, we can't tell people that we need to reform reproductive rights, right? We also want to think about cultural narratives. Now, cultural narratives, they sound a little bit more complex than they really are. Stories, narratives are just the stories that we tell ourselves to make meaning of life and the world around us, right? Sometimes they're good, they inspire us, they motivate us. A good example of one in the Black community now, Black generational wealth, Black generational health, involved Black fatherhood. These are all cultural narratives, right? But they can also be manipulated to drive unsavory opinions of a particular cultural group, right? So policymakers rely on cultural narratives to sway public opinion. That is what public opinion is, or how it takes shape, right? In the form of cultural narratives. Now, in tandem with cultural narratives, we have to think about cultural markers, right? So we talk about culture and it belonging to a particular group, right? Well, how do I know which group? By cultural markers. Those are signifiers, indicators. It's how we classify people. It's how we put them into a box, right? So that we can learn to recognize a particular benefit or threat later on in life, right? So ideology is used to create stories, cultural narratives around particular groups that justify their marginalization or oppression, right? How many times do we talk about, the way that African Americans are presented in the media after they're arrested, right?
Right.
The headline alone, the photographs that you might see, right? Completely different. So those are good examples of how stereotypes are amplified, exploited, right, to drive or reinforce ideology. They want people to, if we want to drive the privatized prison industry, well, then we need to let people know that crime is really high, right? So, and we need to get these criminals off the street. So these are just some of the, I guess, more accessible, commonplace ways that culture mediates kind of how we think about what's good, what's bad, and who's worthy and who's not.
Can we sit here for just a minute? Because culture as a mediator, it makes a lot of clear sense. I can draw some very fine, I'm a lawyer. I like fine lines. I like direct lines that I can clearly see, bright red lines. I love those types of lines. Culture as a mediator in the context of interracial reality makes a lot of sense to me. The ideas that you just put forward, the way we frame who is arrested in the media, whether you get a mug shot versus a shot of you as a high school graduating senior, often, these are all things that sort of play a part of that. That makes a lot of sense. And I can have a very bright line rule and understanding when it comes to white, Black culture interacting. But what about if the culture that is a part of your village, the culture that you are part of, also mediates and shapes narratives in such a way that it is dangerous for the proponents of the culture? Like if you're, and I know somebody in the audience is like, here she go talking about dangerous Black music again. You're right. Here I go talking about a song with a hook that says, I don't give a fuck about your feelings. Part of my language is literally the hook of the song. Like songs that say these are cultural tools as well, aren't they? Isn't can you talk about what danger can exist? I'm not saying all of our music is like this because it's not all of our music, but can you talk with us about the danger that can exist when the culture that we embrace, that we love, that we support, and that we feel a sense of pride in is also serving to mediate a series of communications that are against the very lives that we're trying to protect?
Yeah, Yes. And those are good examples. I mean, you already hit the nail on the head in terms of, I don't give a F about about feelings. The vocabulary that we use, that our young people use, simping, caping, right? Being simple because I'm compassionate, trying to be Superman because I want to actually help somebody out, right? We disparage those who want to lend a hand, who want to give back, who want to empower other people, right? So I think it's an issue. It's a huge issue. It helps to perpetuate violence. Domestic violence rates are sky high and continue to rise. I know Imani can speak to that, being from New Orleans, where it has some of the highest rates in the country. But New Orleans is not the only place, right? I think if you were to let me back up for just a second. I have to say, I didn't know. So I work in health equity. I've been working in culture forever and ever. It wasn't until recently when I shot community narratives in Detroit and New Orleans, which is how I actually had the pleasure of working with Imani, that I really understood the impact that our, how would I say, dream deferred culture, pop culture is having on young people. It is in fact oppressive, and it is limiting our Black imagination, right? It is limiting our ability to kind of believe that there are other realities that are possible. And it's also being exploited. If we think about kind of what songs are at the top 5 on the charts, right? And why is that? And we can go back to what was it, the late 80s, early 90s, when C. Dolores Tucker was waging war against hip hop music.
I remember that as a kid.
Right? But there's a point there. There's a point there because it doesn't serve us. It serves the oppressive forces that want to keep prison pipelines filled, right? And need to kind of create a vision of a particular group or culture as being antagonistic so that they can get the support of the rest of the country, right? Or voters to actually put these policies in place and to sustain the oppression that comes down through these structural forces. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. But
I'm stuck on dream deferred culture as a phrase because we know what happens to a dream deferred. Like, does it ripen? Does it explode? So